1.3 Learning A. Please add 3 pieces of notes for each slide. Make sure that you use the pause button when you need to write, so you're not trying to do 2 things at once. All right, some basic things about the Gilded Age economy. First off, the economy is everything, every sort of financial transaction that goes on within the United States. It's so complicated that people study it for years and years and decades, and they still don't really know exactly what's going on with it, only in the past, and only when they look at it at the past. But our type of economy is capitalism. Private owners run most of the businesses. There's competition. Capitalism is competition. You know, McDonald's is competing with Burger King for your fast food dollar. Walmart and Hy-Vee and Target are all competing for your grocery store money. You have money, and you can do with it what you want. If you want to invest, you can. If you want to save it, you can. If you want to make a business, you can. In pure capitalism, there's little or no government interaction in the economy. We obviously today don't have that because we have minimum wage and other requirements. There's lots of fluctuations that end up going on in the economy, going really, really well, then really, really poorly. Okay, in fact, there's a lot of panics or recessions during the Gilded Age that you can see here. There's 2 basic things that we always say, or that say for the economy, is that it's an upward spiral or a downward spiral. And I make you repeat this in class. People spend money, and then when people spend money, or when they buy stuff, then companies make money. And when companies make money, then they hire people. When more people have jobs, then they buy more stuff. And when they buy more stuff, then other companies make more money, and they hire more people, et cetera, et cetera. That also works in the the downward spiral, when people for some reason stop buying stuff. So companies lose money. So then they fire people. And then more people have less jobs, so they buy less stuff, and then other companies lose money, and the spiral continues. During the Gilded Age, they believed in laissez-faire, which means basically hands-off. So there weren't any rules or regulations. You wonder, well, what happens if a company abuses its workers? Well, the idea is if the company was bad, paid people little, or didn't produce a good product, the market would take care of it. They would go out of business. This led to a belief in social Darwinism. This is an application of Darwin's ideas. It is not Darwin himself. Okay, a guy named Herbert Spencer is actually the one who talked about survival of the fittest and social Darwinism. This is a look at societies and individuals within societies. Societies, these social Darwinists believe that the white Europeans were superior to Africans because obviously they were biologically superior because they had advantages. They had done a better job of science and technology and information. Also, basically, it says that if you were wealthy, it was because you were genetically superior, and if you were poor, it was because you're genetically inferior. Immigrants and African Americans and Native Americans were viewed as biologically inferior, and it actually justified the poor working conditions and the poor pay that those workers got. Here you can see a picture that on the left of scientists that were studying, alleged scientists that were studying this human skull, and pointing out how the Negroes in this thing, how African Americans basically had a skull closer to a chimpanzee than the white superior people. Businesses got really big in the Gilded Age. Pre-Gilded Age, there weren't very many big businesses, only railroads. During the Gilded Age, that's when the explosion of very large companies and the massive accumulation of wealth began. In order to do this, you had to sell parts of your ownership of company. You made that, you turned into a corporation. When big companies sold stock to raise money. Companies do that now. It's called an IPO, initial public offering. Stocks are tiny pieces of ownership, and they go up in value, up or down in value, based on how many people want them. Well, the corporation itself then has a board of directors instead of a single owner, and now the company has a lot of money, so it expands, and it can expand in 2 ways: either vertical integration, when it buys other businesses that produce all the things. So if McDonald's buys a trucking business to move its stuff, and a farm with cows on it and pigs to make the sausage and the beef, instead of buying it from a sausage or beef company. The other type is horizontal integration. This is when a business buys other businesses that produce the same thing. That would be as if McDonald's buys Burger King. oftentimes a horizontal integration is a lot easier to see. You'll see some Verizon Wireless or Vodafone or Sprint or Nextel, or all these companies are buying each other, or banks do this all the time. Wells Fargo has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger in the last 20 years by buying other companies. Here's a picture from your textbook. Oil, you actually start out with oil, it's black, and then you store it, and then you take it to barrels, and then you go to refineries. Refineries basically just cook. They just cook oil. Okay, they don't cook it. They change it to kerosene or gasoline, so it's useful. Here's a picture of a political cartoon. Obviously shows integration as negative. A monopoly is also when one company controls most or all of the type of the product available. Okay, this can keep prices high, making companies wealthier. Carnegie Steel is an example. Sometimes you have a monopoly just by region or area. For example, if you look at just cable companies, typically people only have one or two cable companies available to them. There's not a whole lot of competition until satellite companies come in. But a monopoly is good for big businesses, but bad for the consumer. So another way to make another sort of trick that big businesses use to gain advantages, they would pretend to be competing against each other, two companies, but they would be joined by they would actually run together. They would keep prices high, make sure everybody was making profit, and then that would also, by the way, cost consumers money. It would be difficult. Standard Oil Company was a historical example of a trust. Steel production in the United States absolutely exploded during the Gilded Age. Steel is really, really important. Basically, you get iron ore out of the ground, and then you cook it at thousands of degrees, mix it in with some other stuff, and you create steel. Steel was an expensive but stronger product until the Bessemer process came around. Now, the Bessemer process made it super cheap. So because of that, the massive amounts of iron ore dug up in the United States could be turned into steel. And the big important thing about steel is it kickstarts almost everything in the Industrial Revolution. With iron, you could barely have a building higher than 3 or 4 stories high, or it would fall. With steel, you could have skyscrapers. Railroads, iron or steel rails were pretty expensive to make. Now with the Bessemer process, the steel rails were significantly cheaper, so you could legitimately have longer railroads like the Transcontinental Railroads. The buildings themselves that would create factories and assembly lines, and the machines that would take over in the factories and run these sort of massive production facilities were made of steel. So steel production in the U.S. soars, and the United States becomes the steel maker in the world. Here you can look at the differences in protection that the employee has from the Gilded Age on the left and to the modern picture on the right of a steel mill. Same thing here on the top and the bottom. The top shows that they're much closer to the product and had significantly less gear on. The United States in iron, steel, and coal catches up with the rest of the world and surpasses them in the production, leading it to a financial advantage. Steel rails would also drop for railroads in price because when there's more of something, the price goes down. The guy who made the money in the steel world, Andrew Carnegie. He was a Scottish immigrant, purchased and worked his way up to become a steel mill owner in the 1870s. He actually really focused on being efficient and making sure that you could gain a profit at every single turn. Others use the Bessemer process. He actually used an even newer version called the open hearth furnace as a new way to, it was a new and more profitable way to create steel. He used vertical integration, buying in bulk to dominate steel industry. He would buy an enormous amount of goods, and he would also try to buy up or use railroads. Finally, at the end of his career, he sold Carnegie Steel to a banker named J.P. Morgan, and then eventually gave most of his money away using philanthropy is another word for sort of charitable actions. That's why you have Carnegie libraries all over the place, including Marion and Cedar Rapids. J.P. Morgan made a trust, called it U.S. Steel, and it is still around today. Here you can see Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana. Those are in Michigan. That's called the Rust Belt because that's where all of the so many of the steel mills were at. Now, when we talk about oil, this is also a gigantic industry in the Gilded Age. When we talk about it, we are not talking about gasoline. In fact, the number one demand for oil was kerosene lights, because there also, by the way, was no electricity until in fact, no cities had electricity until like 1890 when New York City had it, in like a block or two. So electricity is not part of people's lives during the Gilded Age. Also, cars are not really a part of people's lives. I associate it with like Google Glass, where very few people have it, but everybody seems to know about it, but the world isn't sort of ready for it. Same thing with cars. In the United States, we actually had 3 massive oil booms that made us the biggest oil producer in the world. In Pennsylvania, then in Texas, and then eventually Alaska, Seward's Folly, as it was nicknamed when we had first purchased it from Russia. Alaska was found to have an enormous amount of oil, so that helped out the United States and businesses within the United States. You can see here that Pennsylvania and Texas definitely increased the oil production, but in 1902, the Alaskan finding oil in Alaska absolutely skyrocketed oil production. So kerosene was the big product for this man, John D. Rockefeller. He used vertical and horizontal integration, and probably was the most ruthless businessman during the Gilded Age. He would reduce his prices temporarily. He would operate at a loss, meaning he would lose money selling oil just to drive other companies out of business or to purchase them. He would also get rebates, which were illegal kickbacks, basically cash back from the railroads, in order to secure a cheaper transportation, which would then mean more profit for him. He created a trust, and basically he won. He had 90% of all America. He was selling 90% of all American oil by 1879. Eventually, it was broken up in 1892, partially for being a monopoly, and he eventually gave away a lot of his $900 million fortune. He was one of the richest men in the United States. Here you can see some of the symbols. You can pause and read that if you'd like, of a political cartoon. Railroads, this really probably should be the first one, because railroads were the first big industry. But not unlike the cable companies, there's a geographical monopoly, because typically you only had one railroad company accessing each area. They could charge whatever they wanted, and they gouged a lot of farmers. Cornelius Vanderbilt was actually the first guy, major railroad owner. He was operated in the Northeast, where most of the of the economic activity was going on. So you had the Great Lakes with the Erie Canal, and you can get to the Atlantic from even Chicago. And also, we reviewed this before, but the Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869. The United States federal government had a lot of money, a lot of land, and they needed to get people out west. So during 1862, there's a Homestead Act that gave land to farmers. There's a Railway Act that gave land to railroads so that railroads could build transcontinental railroads, etc. There's Vanderbilt. Here's a picture of Transcontinental Railroad. Once you get to the Missouri River or Omaha, there's actually an enormous amount of railroads, so it's unnecessary to really draw all the railroads that go to the Atlantic from there. Here is an interesting deal. You can rewind this. The red shows the railroads in 1850, and then 1870, and then 1880, and then 1890. It looks like a disease that spread so much. Massively changed the United States. So is big business good or bad for society? There's cheaper goods. It was cheaper to make things because you can make more things, and you can sell them for cheaper. People who were not skilled had opportunities for labor. But if you did have skill, like you were a shoes maker or something of that nature, your opportunity to make money decreased. There's other jobs like middle management, and labor unions unfortunately rose because out of poor working conditions. People could travel more, and more people moved to urban centers. Urbanization is moving to cities. Rural is the country, and suburban is the area right outside of cities.